Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, I am going to provide dungeon tricks and tips for Theater of Pain. This video is mostly going to focus on important dungeon information that is relevant to tanks, and sometimes for Blood Death Knights in particular. For this particular dungeon, I'm using Night Fae with the Naya Soulbind, Purgatory, Codex of the First Technique, Reactive Defense Matrix, and the Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary. Night Fae and Reactive Defense Matrix are not commonly selected options, but they are two of the relatively more efficient damage flex options available to Blood Death Knights, and especially on lower target counts. Theater of Pain is a unique dungeon in that it doesn't really have any large pulls that are dangerous to the tank, and the dungeon timer isn't nearly as forgiving as it is in other dungeons. And so, aggressive tech options are relatively more valuable in Theater of Pain compared to other dungeons, even on fortified weeks. At the start of the dungeon, you generally want to skip the first pack of enemies if at all possible, and pull the Bloodhorn into the first boss. The first trash pack has some dangerous enemies in it, and you'll get more mileage out of group cooldowns if you open up on the boss. While it's possible to do all of the trash with the first boss, I really wouldn't recommend it in any situation. It makes the first boss extremely difficult to kill, and it would be easier and more time efficient to kill them with the last boss, even if we were playing for time. For this first bowl, you want to be liberal with your cooldown usage at the start of the encounter, because the fight is at its most dangerous for everyone while the Bloodhorn is alive. He melees relatively hard, and he'll do high group damage without enough soothes. As such, focusing on the Bloodhorn is always the safe play, while cleaving him down will result in faster kill times if he is manageable. Searing Death from Sathel is by far the most valuable cast to interrupt, and interrupting all of them will require two standard cooldown kicks unless you have a Shaman, since they are capable of solo kicking the mechanic with their lower kick cooldown. If you or your allies are affected with Searing Death during this fight, it is also the best opportunity for Anti-Magic Shell or Anti-Magic Zone that you will get over the course of the encounter. The random target bolts cast by Passeron and Sathel do the same amount of damage, but Passeron melees for more than double the damage that Sathel does, so tank damage will significantly increase while Passeron is auto-attacking, and it's generally better to kick Sathel's bolts over Passeron's bolts unless you are trying to move Passeron in particular. Passeron teleports to a new location every 15 seconds or so, so Blood Death Knight's kick is perfect for kicking him immediately after he teleports so you can keep everything continuously grouped, while also not locking out Passeron's spells for too long so that he doesn't melee very often. Keeping all of the bosses stacked is going to be the main thing you can do to save time on this fight as a tank, so try to keep getting Passeron back into the pack as soon as possible. If something goes wrong with the kick situation, you can always try to move the other two bosses to Passeron's new location, though you generally want to bring Passeron back in to make use of pre-existing ground effects. Granted, we'll want to make sure the bosses stay out of the toxic puddles on the ground, so I'd recommend using a very slow circular pathing as needed. Also, if you don't have a soothe for Jessia, make sure you are near her when her enrage drops, since she'll slam a nearby player if you aren't near her at the end of the enrage. If you are playing for safety, direct your group to kill Dessia first after the Bloodhorn. Otherwise, the fastest kill strategy is to focus Sathel to 40% health ahead of time to get his 30-second absorb shield on the clock faster, while killing all the bosses evenly after triggering this shield. Also, Death Grip is a very efficient way for you to easily interrupt the rogue when she stunlocks a random party member. But remember that any follow-up attacks on her will likely miss, so switch targets before using any additional abilities like Death Strike. It's worth pointing out that the buff effect that Sathel puts out on the other two bosses heals them for 100% of the damage that Sathel deals, so dispelling them as soon as possible is very valuable. The order in which you clear each section after the first boss is usually determined by the seasonal affix or bloodlust considerations. In Season 2, the Executioner and Incinerator anima powers are usually given priority for higher group damage, followed by using a Bloodlust on Koltharak to make her less dangerous, which is then followed by a Bloodlust on Zav for time efficiency due to how his fight mechanics work. In general, you'll only be able to Bloodlust the first two wing bosses you clear to. In any case, we are going to kill the Executioner first, since he is nearby. Arbalists are the main concern in this first pack, as they deal very high group damage with random shots and a particularly damaging bleed effect every 10 seconds or so. The bleed effect can be delayed with well-timed stuns, but they will always try to recast it after being interrupted. The normal auto attack damage from conscripts also isn't too bad, but conscripts do have a high damage instant cast tank buster that they use every 7 seconds or so their burst damage needs to be respected. Chain pulling is generally safe to do once the Arbalist is dead, but the conscripts do make any chain pull fairly dangerous, especially when chaining to Executioner on a fortified Grievous weak. Even after swapping to a Hysteria weapon specifically for this pull, I am very close to dying by the end of it. And if you are going to chain pull, it can be good to prioritize defensives while conscripts are alive, since things will be easy once they die. As for the Executioner himself, his aura makes anything you pull with him much more difficult, especially as a self-healing tank, so you are very limited in what you can pull with him, if anything at all. His aura affects all healing, but unlike most healing modifiers in the game right now, it doesn't lower the effectiveness of absorbs like Blood Shield or when using Blood Spattered Scale. The aura also makes Rune Tap a net gain for mitigation, which isn't usually the case, and his AoE Fear provides a decent anti-magic shell and anti-magic zone opportunity if you are trying to get some value out of those abilities. With the Executioner dead, we are now going to kill Sagadan, since we don't think we'll be pressed for time in this dungeon. Killing him as soon as possible can help make the run go a lot smoother, since Stone Ward is a powerful defensive anima power, though it's also possible to skip him in Theater of Pain to save time and higher key levels if needed. Sagadan melees for a lot of damage, and he has a ton of burst potential when his auto attacks overlap with his other abilities. He is particularly dangerous right on pull, so don't be afraid to use defensives when pulling Sagadan, especially if you are fighting him with other enemies. After his initial burst, the time he spends channeling his large AoE gives you plenty of time to top off your resources for his next string of auto attacks. After Sagadan, we plan on clearing out the Abomination Wing first in order to get the Incinerator anima power. Unlike Executioner, Incinerator is so deep into the wing that we're committed to clearing the full wing in order to not mess up our Bloodlust timers too badly. When double pulled, the first A-bomb room is surprisingly dangerous, but mostly for the rest of the group and not to ourselves. We want to stay near allies to keep enemies grouped, but we don't want to be within 4 yards of them, otherwise we'll cleave them with damage from the leaving enemies. The top priority kick, stun, or interrupt is Withering Discharge by the Blighted Sludge Spewers, which is used every 15 seconds and does not recast when stopped by any means. It can very easily wipe the group if a cast is successful, so keep an eye out for it and be prepared to use grips or even your stun if needed. Also, if you are going to control Blighted Sludge Spewers for whatever reason, they'll autocast this Withering Discharge ability, and it pulls everything within 50 yards, so just keep that in mind. Beyond that, the only other mechanic that can potentially kill us are the green swirlies that spawn on the ground when the leaping enemies die. It can be easy to forget about these at times, and it can also be hard to see the effect under the Death's Due graphic if you happen to be playing Night Fae. Secondary priority for kicks and crowd control goes into Meat Shield from the Diseased Horror, which is used every 15 seconds when the horror is below 70% health, and it does not recast when interrupted by any means. Third priority for crowd control goes into Devour Flesh, which is a high damage tank buster that heals the Butcher for a multiple of damage done. Granted, Devour Flesh does not appear to leech health from damage dealt to an Absorb shield, so if you know one is coming through, you can attempt to pre-blood shield it or use other absorb effects like Blood Spattered Scale to reduce the healing. Just be aware that Devour Flesh will be used on other allies if you are not within melee range of them when they want to cast the ability. It's also worth noting that almost all of these Abomination Wing pulls, Anti-Magic Shell can absorb decaying flesh casts from Blighted Sludge Spewers, which is the only potential value that you are going to get out of this ability for most of the wing. Your main concern with this Incinerator pull is keeping him away from the side rooms, otherwise you'll risk pulling a Rancid Gas Bag. Speaking of Rancid Gas Bags, they are time inefficient and relatively dangerous, so avoid pulling them whenever possible. As for the Incinerator himself, this is a really awkward place to fight him, but as long as a ranged player is baiting the fire pools away from the melee, it's pretty straightforward. All of Incinerator is a good opportunity for Anti-Magic Shell and Anti-Magic Zone, so feel free to use these cooldowns whenever when fighting him. While there were better ways of killing this inspired mob in particular, Control Undead is very useful in making inspiring a lot more manageable in this dungeon, and there are going to be more than a few areas where I take advantage of that in this dungeon. Ideally, you want to release and kill the inspired mobs with other enemies where the inspiring will be less impactful, but sometimes you'll need to wait for interruptible enemies to die first, or in a worst case scenario, kill them when they're on their own. The upcoming pull doesn't have any new units, but a specific group of enemies triggers when you move into the final hallway. And as long as the rancid gas bag is near the back of that hallway, they can be triggered without pulling him. Though it's preferable if someone else other than you triggers it so that you can build threat on the first group of enemies in the meantime. Just be mindful that the Blighted Sludge Spewer that spawns in this new pack sometimes likes to immediately cast Withering Discharge before he runs to the rest of the group. So, we want to make sure that he is being interrupted when that happens. Spawned enemies global aggro anyone who isn't in stealth or invisible when they spawn. If you did want to skip these for whatever reason, you'll need to coordinate a Shroud or Mass Viz potion so that no one is an eligible target when they spawn. Like the previous rancid gas bags, it's more efficient to skip the upcoming one if at all possible, with either Shroud or Invisibility potions. Because my group has a rogue, I'll be able to take this inspired horror with me to kill it during the upcoming boss. Just make sure that your dots have cleared before you attempt to do any skips. It's common to pull the Butcher and Horror into Gore Chop past a certain key level. Focusing the Butcher in particular can remove a lot of danger from the fight, but as always, it's more efficient to cleave the trash down if you are playing for time. Given a lot of the forced movement involved in this fight, it's especially important for people to interrupt the Devour flesh from the Butcher since it can easily target other players. Similar to the first boss encounter, your defensives are especially important while the trash is still alive, and you want to pay special attention to the boss's tank buster while the trash is alive, since that is the most concerning time for you. Positioning is dictated by two things. First, moving through the hook wall quickly, and second, staying out of the ground zones created from the ads dying. Sadly, Control Undead does not work on the boss ads, so we will not be able to use that to manipulate their positioning. I would suggest trying to use these two lines for default tank positions whenever possible, and I'd lead into the sides a little bit so that you can place more than one set of puddles down on each line. If the ads die near the center of the room, it really restricts everyone's movement and will force you to move more often. The ads in this fight also have the Leaping Thrash ability that cleaves nearby allies, so try not to stack directly on your allies if you can help it. And while you can pre-icebound fortitude the chain wall to walk right through it, I wouldn't do this on purpose because not moving the boss to a chain wall opening kind of trolls your melee players since they'll have to break away from the boss in order to survive the mechanic. After the original two trash mobs die, I then release my inspired horror so that we can cleave it down with the boss. Shackle Souls melee for next to nothing, but they deal frequent bursts of magic damage to random party members. Pull an appropriate amount of Shackled Souls given the affixes and the group cooldowns available, but default to 6 at a time if you don't have any better ideas. Defensive cooldowns can be valuable while grouping them since all of their random target magic abilities will go on you for a time, and you won't need your defensives for anything else anytime soon. Also, unless you'd rather use it on the upcoming Portal Guardian, Shackled Souls are a good anti-magic zone and anti-magic shell opportunity. In fact, Shackled Souls are often more dangerous than Portal Guardians just because of the RNG involved. Since it's inspiring, I am controlling this first inspired Shackled Soul until later, and I will attempt not to pull the inspired Shackled Soul at the end of the hallway, so I can snap it into the first boss later. It's pretty suicidal to do one of these Shackled Soul pulls with an inspired mob running around. Now, unfortunately, we had bad Shackled Soul pathing when we were moving through the hallway, so the inspired Shackled Soul did end up pulling, and we're just going to have to kill it with the rest of the souls, which is not something that I would recommend you normally try to do. If we were quick to act, we could have paralyzed this Shackled Soul and then kill the first 5 before dealing with this later in the upcoming pull. Luckily, this doesn't wipe us, but we do lose our mage because of the situation. As for the Portal Guardian, it provides another anti-magic zone and anti-magic shell opportunity if these abilities are still available. It can also be combined with a nearby Tormentor if you plan on killing it. In this case, I was originally planning on skipping Oros, but my group was getting sad about the fact that they saved cooldowns specifically for this pull, so I ended up bringing him in after they complained. If you have the time available and you don't care about practicing not killing him, you're probably better off killing Oros. The last boss is tricky if you don't kill Oros, but it's still a good way to create time at higher key levels. Going back to this double pull, killing the Portal Guardian first will make your healer's life a lot easier, and Oros himself is pretty easy. We were fighting Oros elsewhere, his random target AoE dot would be a good opportunity for anti-magic zone. But other than that, there's nothing really to worry about on him if you dodge all of his avoidable attacks. Unless you are running a very unique route, it is always better to go to the right platform to fight the two Bone Magi. Assuming you dispel their Bone Shield in a timely manner, Bone Magi are extremely time efficient to kill. So, a lot of Theater of Pain routes will go out of their way to kill all of them. Bone Spear is the priority interrupt since it will one-shot most non-tank players at higher key levels. Their other spells are not very important. I'd suggest using the buddy system for interrupts to make things less confusing. Designate 2 players to interrupt Bone Spear on the left, while 2 more interrupt the Bone Spear on the right. You should have enough kicks and stops to prevent all Bone Spear casts unless you are running a ranged heavy comp with low CC options. If you can, put your longest lockout kicks, such as rogues and mages, in their own buddy group. Having these longer lockouts together will be useful for future pulls. With the second Portal Guardian, we now start seeing maniacal soulbinders who are actually more dangerous than the Portal Guardians themselves. They instantly apply a very damaging dot to a random player on a 4-second cooldown, which is precisely why we're going to assign our longer lockout kicks to this guy in particular, to minimize the amount of dots they are putting out. If you want to go a step further, you can also stun him on the tail end of a kick lockout to prevent more dot applications, and you can pull the pack with Anti-Magic Shell active to immune the first dot application that he attempts to cast on the first person who pulls him. Necrotic Volley is a priority interrupt that is not recast when interrupted with a stun or death grip, though we would prefer he gets kicked to reduce dot applications. I'll be keeping this inspired Bone Magus with me until the next boss, since there aren't any good opportunities to kill him before then, and we're going out of our way to kill all of the Bone Magi because they are very time efficient to kill. Again, you want to be heading to the right platform with any reasonably efficient route, mostly because the right platform has more Bone Magi on it. In addition to the Bone Magi, the one new enemy we have on this platform is a Soul-Forged Bone Reaver, which has a number of avoidable abilities along with very high melee damage. He doesn't have any surprise burst abilities, but you just want to make sure that you're respecting his damage output enough while you are managing the Magi themselves. Make sure you position the Bone Reaver so that the melee have an easy way to avoid his Bone Storm ability whenever he decides to channel it, because some positionings can make it very hard for your melee players to avoid getting hit. If you are doing an optimized route killing all Bone Magi, the standard tactic is to chain in 2 Bone Magi at a time. It's not impossible to do more than 2 at the same time, though it's a bit complicated and it doesn't really save you all that much time, because the Bone Reaver has a pretty good amount of health himself. It's also worth noting that the Bone Reaver is capable of killing your controlled undead if they get too close to him. Controlled enemies only give count if your group has damaged them and if they haven't left combat since your group has damaged them. If I had applied Blood Plague to him and recontrolled him before starting this pull, I could purposely suicide him in the Bone Storm to kill him and get his count. But since I didn't do that in this run, I would not get count if he died in this pull. Since he chain casts spells by default, the Bone Magus is not usually going to get himself killed in this pull unless I manually disable his auto-casting or if I manually move him into melee range myself. For the last platform, we encounter yet another new enemy, a Nefarious Darkspeaker. Their bolts are always cast on the tank, though the damage isn't particularly dangerous, and there are generally more important things to kick in this pack. Our main concern with these enemies will be dodging the tornadoes that they create and making sure you aren't standing in the purple swirlies on the ground, which can fear you for a short duration and cause you to either miss a kick or, in a worst case scenario, get hit by your tornado. However, the purple swirlies are spawned by a curse that is put out on non-tanks, and with a decurse in your party, you generally won't have to worry about them. As with the previous Portal Guardian pull, the Soulbinder is the most dangerous enemy in this pack, assuming everyone is capable of dodging the tornadoes. Koltharok is one of the most dangerous bosses in Theater of Pain, which is why many groups prefer to use a Bloodlust on her. However, she just might be the easiest boss in the game for tanks personally. The only mechanic we are really paying attention to is Phantasmal Parasite, which is a dispellable debuff applied to two random group members that pulses for shadow damage over the duration. Since it is dispellable, your healer should be able to quickly remove one of these two debuffs, while the remaining player will take a high amount of magic damage from the debuff that stays up. You want to spread out from allies so you won't immediately damage them if you get this debuff on yourself. And if you get the debuff, it's the best anti-magic shell and defensive cooldown opportunity you are going to get over the course of this fight. You're looking to use Anti-Magic Zone whenever this dot is going to persist on someone other than yourself and they don't have an immunity immediately available. Particularly on Inspiring weeks, you may be interested in pulling a ghost into this boss. And the best way to do this is to wait for the boss to channel Draw Soul so that you have a moment to pull a ghost with Death's Caress. I was originally planning on doing this until we accidentally pulled the second Inspiring Ghost. While the snapping is a really efficient way to kill ghosts, ghosts can make this fight a lot more dangerous than it already is, so you may want to think twice before creating a route that relies too heavily on this tactic. Beyond that, you can periodically bait the boss into casting a kickable spell on you by leaving melee range, so you can then kick the boss and generate more runic power through your conduit. Though, if you are going to do this, you'd want to line it up with Blood Boils and Death and Decays in your rotation, so you aren't wasting globals. Everything else about this fight is just you hitting a target dummy while you watch your group do mechanics. Nothing here is really capable of killing you on any key level. Next up is one of the most dangerous pulls in the instance as a tank, where I'll be pulling both the first and second champion in the gladiator wing at the same time, while both of the winning gladiators are the ones that do the most tank damage. This is the only other pull in this dungeon I'll be swapping to a Hysteria weapon for, other than the double conscript pull with the Executioner. This pull is risky, and I wouldn't do it if you don't think it is needed, but it saves a significant amount of time once you get to a key level where that time can make the difference between timing a key and depleting it. Dokig has an interruptible enrage that can provide some much needed resources for this pull, so you may want to explicitly ask to let people give you this kick. Other than that, you'll just need to take note of when he'll do elevated damage during his Savage Flurry channel. As for Heaven the Breaker, he'll periodically hit you with Colossal Smash, which increases your physical damage taken by 50% for 10 seconds, which is a time period you'll want to focus your defensives, especially as if Savage Flurry is going off at the same time. For what it's worth, it's possible to parry Colossal Smash, but this is not going to be reliable. It's also worth noting that he even auto-attacks while he's channeling Interrupting Shout, so he can deal some unexpected burst damage if the shout lines up with one of his melee attacks. Overall, this is either the second or third best combination of champions for your group if you're performing this double pull. You generally like to see Dokig as well as Harugia the Bloodthirsty since they are arguably the easiest combination. After doing a lot of in-depth testing on the subject, I'm pretty confident that there is no way to manipulate who the winning duelists are, though I'm sure there's at least one person who strongly disagrees with that statement. There have been a lot of theories on the subject, but I have yet to find one that hasn't been disproven through testing. While most compositions will skip the Captain Pack and kill the third champion, it is faster for groups with Blood Death Knights to kill the Captain Pack instead of the third champion by using Control Undead. The Ancient Captain provides an aura that increases enemy damage by 25% and decreases the AoE damage you deal by 50% when he is not being controlled. So, at a minimum, we want to make sure the dangerous Arbalists are dead before we release him, because two Arbalists can very easily kill our group members even under normal circumstances. Even if we are staggering the pull like this, it is still going to be faster than the third champion. Once the captain himself is released, he isn't overly dangerous himself, but he will use a tank buster on group members if you aren't in melee range of him when he queues up the ability. The captain's aura is only 10% as strong as it normally is when he is being controlled by you, which still makes him one of the stronger undead units to control in any dungeon, but due to a number of complicating factors, you are probably better off just killing him here. I can go into more detail about him in the comments below if someone wants to know more about the problems he can cause if you try to use him in the entire dungeon, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now. The only catch with doing the captain pack instead of the third champion is that the third champion is not as straightforward to skip. She has true sight, so you need to move as a group to pass her before she becomes activated. I've been told that you can also get past her if you activate her first, use Shroud, and distract her in the opposite direction, but I've never tested it or seen it done myself. My healer gets a little confused about what we're doing here and ends up falling behind the group as a result, which gets her killed. So, this is a good example of the main downside to doing the captain pack instead of the third champion. Zav isn't the most difficult boss in this dungeon, but he isn't much easier than some of the harder ones. He'll periodically hit you with a 3-hit attack called Brutal Combo, where each hit does more damage than the last. The 3 hits do about 60%, 90%, and 115% of his regular melee damage. But it's secretly a 4-hit combo since he'll melee attack you about a half second after the final combo attack, so you'll want to be topped before eating the last swing, or you need to have very fast reaction time to Death Strike between his third swing and the following melee. It probably goes without saying, but Brutal Combo is where you'll be focusing your defensive cooldowns. This is the only mechanic that can really kill you on this fight, and everything else is mostly just positioning. As for the banners, they appear to spawn 10 yards away from the boss in a random direction, though I've noticed they usually spawn behind him for whatever reason. We can take advantage of this by moving the boss to the back of the room if no banners are currently up, to make it more likely that the banners spawn close enough to the center and back of the room to cleave them when the boss is forcefully moving to the center of the room and when he is throwing your allies into the dueling ring. You'll generally want to kill the banners while cleaving the boss on lower key levels, though if people know what they're doing, it's possible to focus the boss the entire fight without killing banners at all, but I wouldn't recommend this strategy if you don't need the time. Next, we have Might of Maldraxxus, where Zav jumps to the center of the ring to perform a random series of avoidable attacks. You want to stay at max melee range, where it makes it easier to dodge all of his attacks. Just be aware that his melee AoE will require the most movement to dodge, and that he always uses this move exactly once in the combo. As for the duel mechanic, just be aware that this ability causes him to move to a fixed location, just like Might of Maldraxxus, so you'll want to drop your Death and Decays with this location in mind to maximize damage. Because this duel mechanic periodically stops two of our players from being able to damage the boss, Bloodlust is usually more time efficient on Zav than other bosses, because it reduces the amount of time that our DPS players are disabled. After Zav is dead, it can be beneficial for one of your party members to rush back to the main arena as fast as possible, so that the final boss spawns faster. Though, for this particular run, we have plenty of time. While I normally forget to use it, I swap on a speed weapon with Rune of Unending Thirst to run back to the main arena slightly faster. Now, for the 3-pack in the beginning that I originally told everyone to skip. Unyielding contestants do more tank damage than any other trash mob in this instance. They dual wield with fast, hard-hitting attacks, and they have a high damage tank buster they use every 10 seconds. In addition to this, they have a 15-second cooldown charge they'll use on you if you get out of their melee range, and they'll enrage themselves to increase their damage by 20%, while increasing the damage they take by 20%. Whether or not you have this enrage buff soothed is up to you. The Battlefield Ritualist has a hard-hitting bolt that he'll spam cast on random targets, as well as a buff that he can cast on allies that significantly heals them whenever they land attacks. However, since he's the only kick target around at this point, he's mostly harmless. If you are pressed for time, you can pull this pack onto the last boss, but be aware that the last boss is extremely dangerous while all of these trash mobs are still alive. At the start of the last boss, the middle of the arena is the best place to tanker, and the main mechanic we are concerned about is Reaping Scythe, which is the ability that we are focusing most of our defensives on, including Anti-Magic Shell, since it does a mix of physical and magic damage. Since Dark Devastation faces the direction of a random target, it's best that we don't point this at our ranged players. We don't want to test whether or not our mage can do mechanics since he is used to ignoring them, especially when he is standing in his Rune of Power. Manifest Death can be immuned by Anti-Magic Shell, and the same Anti-Magic Shell can sometimes be used on a Reaping Scythe, which can make it easier for our group to spread out, and it spawns one less add than normal. The add waves are a good opportunity to use Gorfien's Grasp, but as is always the case with using Gorfien's Grasp, you'd like to get some initial threat on all of them before using it. If Gorfien's is down, or if there are any stragglers, use your Kick and Death Grip to help group them up better. As for the grasping rifts, they aren't an issue in Phase 1 since we can sit in the center of the arena, but in Phase 2, they give us some incentive to not be too far on the outside of the arena, since bad rift spawns can put your group in a tough spot if the rift spawns right on top of your group. Once the boss reaches 50%, Phase 2 begins, after the boss does a large AoE that also happens to be a decent anti-magic zone opportunity, though it's arguably better to use Anti-Magic Zone on Reaping Scythe. The ideal Phase 2 positioning is to be on the back left point of the inner pentagon, which is far enough away from the absolute corner of the arena so your group has enough freedom of movement to deal with rift spawns. Sadly, I don't actually use the best positioning in this video, though I am pretty sure that location is a safe spot from all of the Ghost Bowl patterns. With good positioning, the main avoidable damage you'll need to keep an eye on are the Echoes of Carnage circles, since their spawns are seemingly random. But any bad overlap of avoidable abilities has the potential to kill people on this fight. However, if you can struggle through and avoid enough of those mechanics, this dungeon is yours for the taking. If you would like to make it easier for other Blood Death Knights to find this content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there are any additional topics you would like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about Theater of Pain, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.